My sister Chloe smiled at her rehearsal dinner, raising her champagne glass toward me in front of her wealthy new in-laws. She said, "Tell everyone your Navy nickname," thinking she would humiliate me by implying I was an easy woman during my service. But when I calmly wiped my mouth, looked her new uncle, a 70-year-old retired Navy admiral, dead in the eye, and said riptide, he froze. He put down his glass with a shaking hand and ordered her to apologize before anyone else even understood why. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly put toxic family members in their place. I am Nia. I am 33 years old, and I am currently standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Chicago penthouse pouring myself a glass of aged bourbon. Looking out at the glittering city skyline, I cannot help but reflect on the sheer absurdity of my family dynamics. My mother Vivian spent her entire life chasing an illusion. For her, presenting the perfect image of success to the outside world was more important than actually loving her daughters. Vivian believed that our worth as Black women was entirely dependent on how close we could get to white wealth and status. She forced us into etiquette classes we could not afford and bought designer handbags on credit just to keep up appearances. She wanted to erase our authentic selves to fit into a mold she deemed acceptable. Chloe absorbed this toxicity like a sponge. She played the game perfectly, securing a wealthy white fiancé who treated her like a trophy, while his family looked at ours with barely concealed condescension. They tolerated Vivian's loud desperation because Chloe was beautiful and agreeable. I refused to play that game. I chose discipline, structure, and service over shallow social climbing. And for that, I was branded the family failure. To my mother, my military service was a deeply embarrassing mistake that she had to constantly explain away to her social circle. She never knew and never cared to ask that I did not just serve. I became one of the highest-ranking cyber intelligence commanders in the military, handling classified operations that people only see in movies. Today, I am the chief executive officer of a private cyber intelligence firm, holding massive defense contracts. I live a life of stealth wealth, wearing tailored suits, with no visible logos, funding my own empire, while my mother and sister drown in debt trying to look rich. The rehearsal dinner was held at one of the most exclusive five-star steakhouses in Boston. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the long mahogany table. The room smelled of expensive truffles, roasted prime rib, and old money. This dinner was the ultimate prize for Vivian and Chloe. Chloe was marrying Preston, a 32-year-old heir to a massive Boston tech family. His family was the epitome of generational wealth. For Vivian, this marriage was her royal coronation. She spent the entire evening leaning across the table, aggressively fawning over Preston's parents. She wore a gaudy sequined dress that tried much too hard to compete with the quiet, understated elegance of Preston's mother. Chloe sat next to Preston wearing a white silk dress she definitely could not afford, playing the part of the perfect demure bride. I sat near the end of the table, nursing my sparkling water, watching the performance unfold. I had flown in quietly, wearing a simple but impeccably tailored black pantsuit. I did not want to draw attention. I just wanted to fulfill my familial duty and leave. Throughout the three-course meal, I watched my mother try to dominate the conversation. She boasted about imaginary investments and exaggerated Chloe's minor accomplishments at her entry-level marketing job. The Sterling family nodded politely, but their eyes held a quiet judgment. I could see the exact moment Preston's mother realized Vivian was wearing a cheap knockoff of a luxury brand. It was embarrassing, but I kept my mouth shut. I sliced my steak and listened to the clinking of expensive silverware. I knew Chloe was getting irritated because despite her best efforts, the wealthy relatives at the table were more interested in talking about global politics and defense contracts than her wedding registry. She needed to pull the attention back to herself, and the easiest way for her to feel tall was to cut me down. But toxic people cannot stand it when you do not react to their games. They need to poke the bear. They need to prove they are superior. As the plates were being cleared for dessert, Chloe decided she needed one more moment in the spotlight. But instead of delivering a gracious thank you speech to her future in-laws who were paying for this lavish event, she set her sights on her favorite target: me. She picked up her butter knife and tapped it sharply against her crystal champagne flute. The high-pitched ringing silenced the room. Everyone turned to look at her. She flashed a brilliant practiced smile at Preston, then turned her gaze to where I was sitting. Her smile twisted into something sharp and malicious. She looked at me, then looked over at Preston's uncle. Uncle Harrison was a formidable 70-year-old man with a posture carved from decades of military service. He was a retired Navy admiral, a legend in the armed forces, and he had been sitting quietly all evening observing the room with sharp, calculating eyes. Chloe leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. "Naya," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Since we have the great honor of having Admiral Harrison here tonight, and since you also spent some time in the Navy, why do not you share some of your stories with the family?" The room remained quiet. People smiled politely, waiting for a heartwarming anecdote. But Chloe was not finished. Actually, she continued, her voice growing louder, so every single person at the table could hear. "Why do not you tell everyone your Navy nickname? I remember you telling me about it years ago. It was something that implied a woman was very popular with the men on base, was not it? Tell them what they used to call you when you were so easy and eager to please." The sheer audacity of her lie hung in the air. She was deliberately trying to humiliate me in front of a retired admiral and conservative billionaires, painting me as a promiscuous failure who only joined the military to chase men. Several people at the table shifted uncomfortably. Preston looked down at his lap, too spineless to stop his bride. I glanced at my mother. Instead of defending me, Vivian actually covered her mouth and let out a soft, mocking laugh. She leaned over to Preston's mother and whispered loud enough for the surrounding chairs to hear. "My oldest has always been so jealous of Chloe. She dropped out of college to run off to the military because she had absolutely no future. We just pray for her. She is our little family burden." They were trying to strip me of my dignity, hoping I would shrink into my chair, maybe run out of the restaurant in tears. They wanted to elevate themselves by standing on my neck. I did not blush, I did not cry, I did not raise my voice or scramble to defend my honor. I simply picked up my linen napkin and slowly wiped the corners of my mouth. I placed the napkin neatly beside my plate. Then I bypassed my mother and sister entirely. I locked eyes directly with Admiral Harrison at the other end of the table. His sharp, weathered face was studying me intently. The entire room waited for my response, expecting a defensive stammer or a shameful retreat. Instead, I held the Admiral's gaze, let a cold, calm smile touch my lips, and spoke exactly one word: "Riptide." When I spoke that single word, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Admiral Harrison had been in the middle of lifting his crystal glass of scotch to his lips. He stopped. His hand visibly trembled, causing the amber liquid to slosh against the sides of the glass. He slowly lowered it to the table, never breaking eye contact with me. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking completely shocked. He knew exactly what that word meant. He knew it was not a dirty joke or a derogatory insult. He knew that Riptide was the highly classified call sign of the cyber warfare phantom who had single-handedly hacked into an enemy terrorist grid and pulled his own son's special forces unit out of a deadly ambush 5 years ago. He knew he was staring at the person who saved his family. The silence stretched out, becoming agonizing for everyone else in the room who did not understand the exchange. Chloe, oblivious to the shift in power, let out a sharp, obnoxious laugh. "See," she said, gesturing toward me. "I told you she was a joke." Admiral Harrison stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Chloe, his voice booming with the authority of a man used to commanding thousands. "You do not have the right to speak that name in this room," he roared. "You will apologize to your sister right now, or I will personally ensure this entire wedding is canceled before the morning." The entire restaurant seemed to stop breathing. Not a single person laughed. The smug satisfaction that had been resting on Chloe's face instantly evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed terror. Next to her, Preston looked like he had been struck by lightning. The absolute silence in the private dining room was deafening, broken only by the sound of the Admiral's heavy breathing and the steady drip of spilled scotch falling from the mahogany table onto the plush carpet. Preston's father, Arthur Sterling, was the first to find his voice. He placed his napkin down, his aristocratic features pulled into a tight frown. "Harrison," he said cautiously, "what is the meaning of this? Who is Riptide?" Admiral Harrison did not look at his brother. His piercing eyes remained locked on my sister, pinning her to her chair like a specimen under glass. He leaned forward, bracing his large, weathered hands against the table. The veins in his neck were visible. "You sit there in your expensive dress playing the role of a sweet, innocent bride." The Admiral spat, his voice laced with a disgust so profound it made Chloe physically flinch. "And you dare to use that name as a cheap punchline. You dare to imply that it stands for something dirty, something shameful. You spoiled, ignorant little girl." Chloe's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked at our mother for help, but Vivian was frozen, her mind short-circuiting as she watched the most powerful man in the room tear her golden child apart. "Let me educate you on the reality of the world outside your country clubs and wedding registries." The Admiral continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly calm that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. 5 years ago, a Navy SEAL team was ambushed in a highly hostile sector of the Middle East. They were pinned down in a concrete compound. Their communications were completely jammed. Enemy combatants were closing in from all sides. They had no air support. They had no way to call for extraction. They were entirely cut off, and they were preparing to die. The entire table was spellbound. The wealthy executives and socialites had stopped breathing, completely captivated by the raw emotion radiating from the retired military commander. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting neatly in my lap. I kept my face impassive, though inside the memory of that night was flashing behind my eyes. The cold glow of the monitors, the frantic keystrokes, the adrenaline that burned like acid in my veins. "One of those men trapped in that compound was my son," the Admiral said, his voice cracking for a fraction of a second before hardening into steel again. "My only son." The military had essentially written them off. The encryption on the enemy communications grid was considered impenetrable, but there was one cyber warfare operative stationed at a remote command center who refused to stand down. A phantom in the intelligence community. A digital ghost known only by a classified call sign. He turned slowly, his gaze shifting from the terrified bride to me. The anger in his eyes vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, profound reverence that made my throat tighten. "Riptide," he whispered the name like a prayer. The Admiral stood completely upright, squaring his shoulders as if standing at attention. He looked back at the rest of the table. Riptide single-handedly hacked into a closed, heavily guarded terrorist grid in under 12 minutes. A feat that entire teams of intelligence analysts had declared impossible. Riptide dismantled their jamming signals, rerouted their internal communications, and fed false coordinates to the enemy reinforcements, sending them 5 miles in the wrong direction. Riptide opened a secure channel, guided my son's team through a maze of hostiles, and secured their extraction. He pointed back at Chloe, who was now trembling visibly, her face the color of chalk. "That operative saved my son's life," the Admiral thundered. "That operative saved the lives of 12 American heroes. It is a call sign that commands absolute respect in the highest echelons of the Pentagon. And you sit here and try to turn it into a joke about promiscuity to make yourself feel superior." The collective gasp from the Sterling family was audible. Preston's mother covered her mouth, staring at Chloe with absolute horror. The quiet, polite judgment from earlier had transformed into blatant disgust. Chloe had not just embarrassed herself. She had insulted a decorated war hero and mocked the very person who had saved the Sterling family's own flesh and blood. "I am so sorry," Chloe finally stammered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "I did not know. I swear I did not know. I was just joking. It was just a misunderstanding." "You were not joking," the Admiral snapped back. You are trying to publicly humiliate a woman who has more honor, courage, and integrity in her little finger than you possess in your entire body. I do not care if you did not know the details. Your intent was malicious. It was poison. And I will not sit at a table and break bread with a viper. Preston finally found his spine, though it was far too late. Uncle Harrison, please, he pleaded, his face flushed with embarrassment. She did not mean it. Do not defend her, Preston, the Admiral commanded sharply. If you marry a woman who finds joy in stepping on her own sister's neck, you are a fool. He turned to Arthur Sterling. Arthur, if this wedding proceeds tomorrow, do not expect me there. I will not endorse this union. The Admiral then turned to me. He did not say another word. He simply raised his right hand and delivered a crisp, perfect formal military salute. The gesture was so profound, so deeply respectful, that it sent a shockwave through the room. I slowly stood from my chair. I looked the Admiral in the eye and returned the nod, a silent acknowledgement between two people who understood the weight of service. The power dynamic in the room had completely flipped. The narrative my mother and sister had spent years spinning portraying me as the broken, jealous failure had just been incinerated in front of the exact people they were trying to impress. The Sterling family was looking at me with awe and looking at Chloe as if she were a piece of trash stuck to the bottom of their shoes. It was the ultimate vindication. I had not needed to boast. I had not needed to stoop to Chloe's level. I had simply let the truth speak for itself. But I had underestimated the depths of my mother's delusion. Instead of feeling shame, instead of apologizing to the Admiral, or to me, Vivian's narcissism violently rejected reality. In her twisted mind, I had not just been vindicated. I had deliberately stolen the spotlight from her golden child. I had ruined her royal coronation. Vivian slammed her hands down on the table with a loud smack. Crystal glasses rattled against the plates. She stood up so abruptly that her chair tipped over backward, crashing to the floor. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Her eyes were blazing with a hatred so intense it was almost frightening. She did not look at the Admiral. She did not look at the Sterlings. She marched straight toward me, her sequined dress catching the light like a warning siren. Before I could react, her hand shot out. Her long nails dug viciously into the bare skin of my forearm. Her grip was like a vice, sharp and punishing. "How dare you!" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that carried perfectly in the dead silent room. "How dare you ruin your sister's special night with this ridiculous attention-seeking stunt?" She yanked my arm so hard I nearly stumbled forward. "Get out!" she commanded, her voice rising into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "Get out right now!" She did not wait for me to walk. Still digging her nails into my arm, she practically dragged me away from the table, hauling me forcefully toward the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room. The Sterling family watched in absolute stunned silence as the mother of the bride violently removed a decorated war hero from the room for the crime of being respected. I let her drag me. I did not fight back. I just kept my head high, knowing that every step she took was another nail in the coffin of her own reputation. Vivian's grip was bruising, her meticulously manicured nails digging into my forearm like talons. She hauled me away from the glowing chandeliers and the stunned faces of the Sterling family, marching me down a quiet, carpeted hallway. I let her drag me. I did not fight back. I just kept my head high, my face an impenetrable mask of calm, knowing that every step she took, every frantic tug she gave my arm, was just another nail in the coffin of her own carefully constructed reputation. She shoved me through the heavy oak doors, into the restaurant's private VIP lounge, letting the thick wood swing shut behind us to seal us off from the shocked silence of the main dining room. The space was completely soundproofed, lined with dark, imposing mahogany panels, and filled with tufted leather sofas that smelled of rich cigar smoke and old money. I smoothed the sleeve of my tailored blazer, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me flustered. I deliberately walked over to the nearest leather sofa and sat down, crossing my legs with a slow, methodical grace. I rested my hands in my lap, keeping my eyes razor-sharp and ice-cold as I looked up at the frantic, hyperventilating woman pacing the expensive Persian rug in front of me. I sat there and simply watched my mother unravel, This was the woman who had spent my entire childhood preaching her twisted, toxic version of black excellence. To Vivian, excellence had absolutely nothing to do with character integrity, intellectual curiosity, or lifting up your community. It was a calculated, hollow performance. It meant wearing the right designer labels, securing invitations to the right social galas, and bowing down to anyone with a larger bank account and a recognizable last name. She had conditioned Chloe to be the perfect, compliant doll, an empty vessel willing to trade her self-respect for an exclusive zip code and a massive diamond ring. I was the stubborn mule who refused to learn the choreography. My mother had happily watched her youngest daughter mercilessly mock a military veteran at a table full of conservative billionaires, yet she was the one vibrating with fury because I had the audacity to survive the execution. Vivian stopped her frantic pacing and lunged at me. She grabbed my shoulders, her fingers digging violently into my jacket, and practically shoved me backward into the corner where the heavy leather sofa met the paneled wall. Her breath smelled of expensive champagne and bitter, unadulterated desperation. "Do you want to ruin your sister's chance to enter high society?" she shrieked, drops of spit flying from her lips as she leaned over me. "I do not care if you are a hero or a spy or whatever ridiculous fantasy that old man was spouting out there. You made us look like fools. You humiliated this family." It was breathtaking to witness her delusion up close. The Admiral of the United States Navy had just exposed me as a highly classified cyber warfare commander who saved his own son's life from a terrorist ambush. He had stood at absolute attention and saluted me in front of Boston's most elite, powerful families. And my mother was furious because I had upstaged a shallow conversation about wedding registries. She did not care that I had saved lives. She did not care about the crushing weight, the sleepless nights, and the immense sacrifice attached to the call sign Riptide. She only cared that the Sterlings were angry at Chloe, that her golden ticket to generational wealth was suddenly in severe jeopardy. "You are going to fix this?" Vivian demanded, her eyes wide and manic, her fingers pressing harder into my collarbone as she tried to physically intimidate me. "You are going to walk right back out there and beg for their forgiveness. And then you are going directly to the front desk and you are going to pay the $25,000 bill for this dinner to apologize right now." I stared at her, completely unfazed by her physical proximity or her shrill volume. $25,000. I knew exactly how they had racked up that astronomical bill. Chloe and Vivian had insisted on hosting the rehearsal dinner at this five-star establishment, taking on a massive financial responsibility that traditionally fell to the groom's family. They had ordered imported Wagyu beef white truffles, flown in from Italy, and bottles of vintage Bordeaux that cost more than my mother's monthly mortgage payment. They did it just to prove they could play in the same elite, untouchable league as the Sterlings. They had planned to put the entire exorbitant amount on a high-interest credit card, drowning themselves further in insurmountable debt solely for the sake of optics. Now that their grand performance had blown up in their faces, Vivian expected me to bail them out. She wanted me to pay $25,000 as a penalty for being insulted. And if I refuse, I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, steady whisper that struck a sharp contrast to her hysterical shouting. Vivian's face twisted into an ugly, vindictive sneer. She leaned in closer, trying to use the same psychological manipulation tactics that had worked when I was a vulnerable teenager. "If you refuse, I will make sure you are dead to our community. I will go to Pastor Thomas tomorrow morning. I will stand at the pulpit in front of the entire congregation and tell them how you disrespected your family. I will tell the choir, the deacons, and the elders how you selfishly tried to destroy your sister's holy union out of spite and bitter jealousy." She smiled, her eyes gleaming with a sick, triumphant light. "I will tell them you are a wicked, broken woman who hates to see her own blood succeed. You know they will believe me, Nia. I have spent years laying the groundwork. I have spent years standing up in Sunday service asking them to pray for my lost, troubled daughter. You will be a pariah. I will drag your name through the mud until you cannot even show your face in this city again." She was using the church, the very place she used to parade us around in our matching Sunday best, as a weapon. This was her ultimate trump card, the final threat she always relied on to force compliance. For years, she had meticulously controlled the narrative in our neighborhood parish, painting herself as the long-suffering, pious mother of a difficult, rebellious daughter. She genuinely believed her fabricated social standing in a local church carried enough weight to force the CEO of a multi-million-dollar defense contracting firm into submission. It was pathetic, and it was the absolute last time I would ever let her speak to me that way. I placed my hands on her wrists, preparing to forcefully remove her grip, stand up and tell her exactly where she could shove her $25,000 bill and her empty, desperate threats. But I never got the chance to deliver the killing blow. The heavy oak doors of the VIP lounge swung open with a resounding heavy thud. Vivian froze instantly, her hands dropping from my shoulders, as if she had been burned by a hot iron. She spun around, frantically arranging her face into a pleasant, apologetic, subservient mask. She smoothed the front of her sequined dress, fully expecting to see a waiter coming to check on us, or a restaurant manager responding to the shouting. Instead, Arthur Sterling stepped into the room. Preston's father, the billionaire CEO of Sterling Technologies, looked like a walking thundercloud. His aristocratic features were set in stone, his posture rigid with a terrifying, quiet fury. He did not look at me. He did not even glance in my direction to acknowledge my presence on the sofa. He fixed his cold, calculating gaze entirely on my mother. The absolute, unvarnished disgust in his eyes made Vivian physically shrink back, her confident, aggressive demeanor instantly dissolving into a puddle of subservient panic. He adjusted his silk tie with a slow, deliberate movement, his voice cutting through the tense, heavy air of the room like a surgical scalpel. "Your family should settle your own financial matters." Arthur Sterling's voice was a low, rumbling baritone that carried the absolute finality of a man who owned half the city. His words hung in the air of the VIP lounge, thick and suffocating. Vivian froze entirely. Her hands, which had been practically clawing at my shoulders seconds prior, dropped to her sides as if all the motor functions in her brain had completely short-circuited. She spun around, her mouth opening and closing in a desperate, silent panic. The aggressive, domineering woman who had just threatened to destroy my reputation in front of our entire community vanished in the blink of an eye, replaced by a terrified social climber caught in the act. Arthur did not wait for an explanation. He did not ask what we were arguing about. He simply stared at my mother with a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion, the kind of look one might reserve for something unpleasant scraped off the bottom of a shoe. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked back out into the main foyer, the heavy mahogany doors swinging shut behind him. I stood up slowly from the leather sofa. I reached up and methodically brushed my shoulder, wiping away the invisible stain of my mother's frantic grip. I adjusted the lapels of my tailored blazer, maintaining a steady, ice-cold composure that I knew terrified her more than any shouting match ever could. "You heard the man, Vivian," I said, my voice dangerously soft and completely devoid of the panic she had expected to see. "Let us go settle your tab." I did not wait for her to gather her wits. I turned and walked out of the lounge, leaving her scrambling in her gaudy sequined dress to keep up with my long, purposeful strides. The walk from the private dining room to the main reception area felt like a funeral march for my mother's grand delusions. When we stepped into the grand marble foyer of the restaurant, the entire Sterling family was still there. They had not rushed to the valet. They were waiting, standing in a tight, protective cluster around Admiral Harrison. Chloe was clinging to Preston's arm, her face buried in his shoulder as she forced out loud, theatrical sobs. She was playing the fragile, victimized bride, hoping that her performance would somehow erase the malicious venom she had spewed at the dinner table. But her fake tears dried up instantly, the moment she peeked over Preston's shoulder and saw me walking toward them, completely unscathed and entirely unapologetic. Behind the massive, polished marble reception desk stood the restaurant's general manager. He was a distinguished, sharply dressed man who looked profoundly uncomfortable holding a thick black leather folio. Inside that folio rested the itemized receipt for the evening's catastrophic extravagance. $25,000, the cost of imported Wagyu beef, white truffles, and vintage champagne that Vivian and Chloe had ordered specifically to prove they belonged in the exact same tax bracket as the billionaires currently staring at them in silent judgment. Vivian scurried up right behind me, her breathing shallow and ragged. She reached out and gave me a hard, desperate shove toward the marble counter. "Pay him!" she hissed through gritted teeth, her voice a frantic, ugly whisper that echoed loudly in the cavernous foyer. "You owe us this after the horrible stunt you just pulled in there. You ruined your sister's night. Fix it." I looked at the general manager. He offered me an apologetic, tight-lipped smile, clearly caught in the crossfire of a family implosion he wanted no part of. I did not sigh. I did not argue. I did not scramble to pull out my phone to check bank balances or ask for a payment plan. I maintained absolute terrifying eye contact with my mother as I reached into the inner breast pocket of my blazer. I withdrew a single piece of matte black titanium and placed it onto the cool marble counter with a sharp, decisive clink. It was an American Express Centurion card. It had no flashy gold lettering, no colorful bank logos, and no preset spending limit. It was heavy, dark, and recognized exclusively by the ultra-wealthy. I saw Arthur Sterling's eyes snap immediately toward the counter. As a man who likely possessed one himself, he knew exactly what that nameless black metal card represented. He knew the astronomical annual spending required just to receive the invitation to carry it. Preston's jaw visibly dropped. Vivian, however, was too consumed by her own panic to understand the significance of the titanium card sitting on the marble. She just saw a piece of plastic and let out a shaky, relieved breath, assuming I had caved to her demands. I did not hand the card to the manager. I kept my fingertips pressed firmly against the cool metal, pinning it to the counter. I turned my head, locking my gaze onto Vivian. I pitched my voice perfectly, ensuring that every single syllable I spoke carried clearly across the quiet foyer to where the Sterling family stood listening. "You know, Vivian," I said, offering her a cold, razor-sharp smile that held absolutely zero warmth. "This $25,000 dinner is actually quite a bargain. It is certainly much cheaper than the $60,000 of my college tuition money that you secretly withdrew to throw Chloe's lavish 21st birthday party 10 years ago." The silence that followed was absolute. It felt as though all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the grand foyer. Vivian let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, taking a physical step backward as if I had just struck her across the face. Chloe froze completely, her mouth falling open, the fake victim routine shattering into a million pieces. The Sterlings stood paralyzed, their expressions shifting from quiet judgment to profound, horrified disgust. Admiral Harrison's jaw tightened, his sharp eyes narrowing as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. That was the truth my mother had spent a decade desperately covering up. That was the real reason I had dropped out of university. It was not because I lacked ambition, and it was certainly not because I had no future, as she had so gleefully whispered at the dinner table. It was because my own flesh and blood had stolen the money my late grandmother had left for my education. Vivian had drained my trust fund behind my back, pouring every last cent into renting a country club, hiring a celebrity DJ, and buying an absurd designer gown for Chloe's 21st birthday, all to impress a circle of superficial friends who did not even care about them. When I discovered the theft, I had no money, no degree, and no options. I was forced to enlist in the military just to survive and get my life back on track. My mother's ultimate betrayal was the exact catalyst that had pushed me into the Navy, the exact crucible that had forged me into the cyber intelligence commander known as Riptide. Vivian's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. She looked frantically at Arthur Sterling, then at Preston, trying to formulate a lie, a defense, anything to spin the narrative back in her favor. But there was nowhere left to hide. The ugly, rotting core of our family dynamic had just been laid bare under the bright crystal lights of the restaurant. I finally lifted my fingers from the black titanium card, sliding it across the marble toward the general manager. He picked it up with practiced efficiency, slipping it into the discreet card reader terminal, hidden behind his monitor. The machine beeped. The manager looked down at the digital screen to confirm the transaction. He frowned slightly, his brow furrowing as he tapped a key on his keyboard. He stared at the glowing monitor for a long, heavy second. Then his eyes widened fractionally. He looked at the screen, looked down at the heavy black card in his hand, and then looked slowly up at me. He did not hand the card back across the counter. He bypassed the payment terminal entirely. The general manager stepped out from behind the massive marble podium. He walked directly into the center of the foyer, planting his feet firmly on the intricate mosaic tile. He smoothed the front of his tuxedo jacket, clasped his hands in front of him, and bowed deeply, bending a full 90 degrees at the waist, in a display of absolute unquestioning deference. "Madam Chairman," the manager said, his voice ringing with profound reverence through the dead silent room. "I apologize for the confusion. This is an internal transaction. The system does not allow billing at a restaurant you personally own." The earth stopped spinning. Arthur Sterling, a man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar mergers, stood completely rooted to the spot, his aristocratic composure cracking as genuine shock washed over his features. Preston looked like he was going to be physically sick, his eyes darting frantically between me and the manager as his brain desperately tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Chloe swayed on her feet, looking as though her legs could no longer support her weight. The luxurious five-star steakhouse she had bragged about booking, the venue she had chosen specifically to intimidate me and impress her billionaire in-laws, belonged to me. Vivian looked as if she had just been hit by a freight train. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it bordered on madness. She had spent the entire evening treating me like a peasant who should be grateful just to sit at her table. She had tried to force me to empty my bank account to cover her pathetic attempt at social climbing. She had no idea that I did not just have enough money to pay the bill. I had enough money to buy the building, fire the staff, and turn the property into a parking lot if I so desired. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my suite at the Four Seasons. I sat at a glass dining table, sipping black coffee and reviewing quarterly reports for my cybersecurity firm. The quiet luxury of the morning was violently interrupted when my suite door was thrown open. Chloe had obviously bullied the concierge into granting her access. She stormed into my room, flanked by 3 of her white bridesmaids. These were wealthy, entitled women who had likely spent the entire morning hyping up my sister's righteous indignation. Chloe had learned absolutely nothing from the humiliation of the previous night. Instead of displaying an ounce of remorse or humility, she was operating on pure, unadulterated entitlement. She marched right up to my table and slammed a piece of thick crested paper down next to my coffee cup. It was an invoice from a luxury travel agency. The itinerary detailed a multi-destination honeymoon featuring overwater bungalows in the Maldives and a penthouse suite in Dubai. The total balance due sat at a staggering $100,000. "You own Belmont's!" Chloe shrieked, her voice stripped of any sisterly affection, vibrating with raw greed. "You own the entire restaurant group. You are sitting on a fortune, and you let me go to shady lenders to take out predatory loans for a wedding you could have funded with your pocket change. You humiliated me in front of Preston's family, Nia. You owe me this." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the invoice, her face flushed with fury. "Pay this right now. Consider it your mandatory wedding gift. If you do not clear this balance today, I will strip you of your bridesmaid title and you will be completely banned from the wedding photos. I will make sure everyone knows you are a selfish, bitter woman who abandoned her own family." I looked at the piece of paper, then looked up at Chloe's demanding expression. The sheer audacity was almost comical. She genuinely believed that kicking me out of a bridal party I never wanted to be part of was some kind of ultimate leverage. She thought the threat of social exclusion would force me to open my checkbook. I took a slow sip of my coffee, placed the porcelain cup back on its saucer, leaned back in my chair and looked her dead in the eye. "Number." Before Chloe could launch into another screaming tantrum, Vivian pushed her way past the bridesmaids. She looked haggard. The dark circles under her eyes betrayed a sleepless night spent agonizing over how to repair the damage with the Sterlings. But true to form, she instantly aligned herself with her golden child, viewing me only as a resource to be exploited. "Nia, you will do this for your sister right now," Vivian demanded, her voice shrill and desperate. "You have millions of dollars that you kept hidden from us. You owe this family for the sacrifices we made to raise you. You will pay for this honeymoon or I will ruin you." I cut her off, my voice cold and flat. "Or what, Vivian? You will banish me from a family that already treats me like dirt. I am not funding Chloe's vanity project, and I am certainly not rewarding your decades of financial abuse." Vivian's composure finally shattered completely. The polished, manipulative matriarch vanished, replaced by a terrified, cornered animal. She slammed her hands down on the glass table, her eyes wide with a frantic, unhinged panic. "If you do not pay this, I will lose the house I am living in," she blurted out, her voice cracking as the ugly truth spilled from her lips. The luxurious suite went completely silent. Chloe spun around to stare at our mother, her mouth hanging open. The bridesmaids exchanged uncomfortable, shocked glances. The pristine, bulletproof facade of generational wealth my mother and sister had spent years projecting to the world was instantly reduced to dust. They were completely broke, leveraging their very shelter to fund an illusion. I did not gasp. I did not show a single ounce of surprise. I simply let a slow, cold smirk touch my lips. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating my face, fully prepared to deliver the first fatal blow I had been holding on to for 5 years. I did not say a word at first. I let the absolute silence of the luxury suite press down on them. I stood up from the glass table, walked over to the suite's wet bar, and calmly poured myself a fresh glass of sparkling water. The fizzing of the bubbles was the only sound in the room. I took a slow sip, letting my eyes rake over my mother's terrified face and my sister's confused, greedy expression. The 3 wealthy bridesmaids who had marched in with such unearned arrogance were now shifting uncomfortably, sensing that the dynamic in the room was entirely out of their control. I walked back to the table and turned the laptop around so the high-definition screen faced them directly. On the screen was a digitized stack of legal documents heavily watermarked and stamped with bold red lettering. I looked at Vivian, my voice dropping into a register of pure lethal calm. "You just confessed out loud in front of 4 witnesses that you leveraged the house to pay for this ridiculous charade," I said. "But you left out a few key details, Mother. You forgot to mention that the house was left to both Chloe and me jointly by grandmother. You also forgot to mention that you forged my signature on the mortgage documents to secure that line of credit." Vivian's skin turned the color of old ash. The bridesmaids gasped, taking a collective step away from my mother, as if her fraud might suddenly become contagious. Chloe stared at the screen, her brow furrowing as she tried to comprehend the dense legal text flashing before her eyes. "You took out a massive predatory loan against a property you did not fully own." I continued, tapping the screen with one perfectly manicured finger. "You went to Vanguard Private Credit because no traditional bank would touch your atrocious credit score. You thought you were so clever, sneaking around the law just to fund a $100,000 honeymoon and a wedding designed to impress people who fundamentally despise you." Vivian opened her mouth, stammering desperately, trying to find a lie to cover the stark truth staring her in the face. "It was just a temporary loan," she choked out, her hands trembling as she clutched her expensive purse. "I was going to pay it back. Preston's family was going to help us once the marriage was finalized. We just needed to bridge the gap to keep up appearances." I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was a cold, unforgiving sound that made my mother flinch. Preston's family is currently trying to figure out how to distance themselves from the massive public relations nightmare you caused last night. They are not giving you a single dime. But that is not even the best part. I leaned closer across the table, bracing my hands on the cool glass. "Tell me, Vivian, did you ever bother to research who actually owns Vanguard Private Credit?" My mother stared at me, her chest heaving, the horrific realization slowly dawning in her widened eyes. "Vanguard is a boutique financial subsidiary," I explained, enunciating every word with deliberate precision. "It is owned and operated by my cybersecurity conglomerate. We use it to finance private tech ventures and manage internal capital. You did not borrow money from a faceless bank, Mother. You borrowed money from me." Chloe let out a shrill shriek, her hands flying to her head. "No, that is impossible. You are making this up to ruin my day." I ignored her completely, keeping my gaze locked on Vivian, who was now trembling so violently she had to grip the back of a dining chair just to stay upright. "For 5 years, I watched you pretend I did not exist. I watched you brag about Chloe's mediocre accomplishments while you drained the very foundation of our family history to fund her vanity. When my financial team flagged the forged application 6 months ago, they asked if I wanted to involve the federal authorities immediately. But I told them no. I told them to approve the loan. I let you take the rope, Vivian, and I simply watched you tie the knot around your own neck. You missed your last 3 payments, I stated, my voice as cold and hard as ice. The grace period expired at midnight last night. The bank is not seizing your house, Vivian. I am. I bought the debt entirely. And at 6 o'clock this morning, while you were busy trying to figure out how to bully me into paying for your daughter's luxury vacation, I signed the final foreclosure order. You are officially homeless. The room erupted. Vivian let out a gut-wrenching wail, collapsing into the chair as her knees completely gave out. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically as the full, crushing weight of her financial ruin and imminent legal trouble crashed down upon her. She had gambled everything on a lie, and she had lost spectacularly. But Chloe did not cry. Chloe snapped. Her golden facade, her carefully curated persona of the perfect demure bride vanished completely. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She realized in that exact moment that the money was gone, the house was gone, and her leverage over me was a complete and utter illusion. The Sterling family was already disgusted with her, and now she had absolutely no financial backing to cushion the blow. "You monster!" Chloe screamed, her voice tearing through the elegant suite like a jagged blade. She lunged forward, grabbing the steaming cup of black coffee from the glass dining table. With a vicious sweeping motion, she hurled the boiling liquid directly at me. I turned my body slightly, but I could not avoid it completely. The dark, scalding coffee splashed heavily across the front of my expensive, tailored pale pink bridesmaid dress, staining the pristine silk with a dark, ugly streak. The heat seared through the thin fabric, stinging my skin. The bridesmaids shrieked in horror, scrambling backward toward the door. Even Vivian snapped her head up, shocked out of her sobbing fit by the sudden physical violence. "Get out!" Chloe roared, her chest, heaving, her eyes wide and manic as she pointed a shaking accusatory finger at the door. "Get out of my room! Get out of my wedding! You are a jealous, miserable, vindictive person. I do not want you anywhere near my ceremony. You are dead to me." I looked down at the ruined silk of my dress. The coffee was hot, burning uncomfortably against my collarbone, but I did not flinch. I did not shout back. I did not give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control or show an ounce of pain. I calmly picked up a thick white linen napkin from the room service tray. I methodically wiped the lingering drops of coffee from my hands and wrists, my movements deliberate, precise, and entirely unbothered by her screaming. I tossed the stained linen napkin onto the extravagant honeymoon invoice she had tried to force me to pay just moments before. "I am not the one who forged federal documents, Chloe," I said softly, my voice carrying a quiet, terrifying finality that silenced her screaming. "I am not the one who built a life entirely on lies and other people's money. Enjoy your wedding. I hear the Sterlings are absolutely thrilled to be marrying into a family facing imminent federal fraud charges." I closed my laptop with a sharp, echoing click. I tucked the silver device neatly under my arm, adjusted the lapel of my ruined dress, and turned my back on them both. I walked out of the luxury suite with my head held high, the sound of my mother's hysterical, broken sobbing, and my sister's enraged, desperate screaming fading behind me as the heavy door clicked securely shut. The quiet click of the heavy suite door sealing shut behind me felt like the closing of a vault. I did not look back. I walked down the plushly carpeted corridor of the Four Seasons, leaving the muffled sounds of my mother's hysterical sobbing and my sister's enraged shrieking behind. I took the private elevator up to my own penthouse suite, the silence of the ascent allowing my mind to sharpen into total clarity. I had just detonated the explosive charge I had been building for 5 years, but the fallout was far from over. Vivian and Chloe were desperate, cornered animals facing the absolute destruction of their carefully curated illusion, and cornered animals always strike out blindly. Inside my suite, I walked directly to the wastebasket and dropped the ruined coffee-stained pink silk bridesmaid dress into the trash. It belonged exactly where they had tried to put me, discarded and ruined. But I had prepared for this. I knew that my tenure as a subservient silent prop in Chloe's grand performance would not last the morning. I walked into the massive walk-in closet and unzipped a black garment bag I had brought specifically for the aftermath. Inside hung a custom-tailored power suit. It was immaculately cut, featuring a structured blazer with sharp, commanding shoulders and wide-leg silk trousers. And it was pure, blinding, pristine white. Wearing white to a wedding was the ultimate social taboo, a blatant, unapologetic declaration of war against the bride. For years, I had muted my colors, hidden my success, and shrunk myself down to make my mother and sister feel comfortable. Today, I was done shrinking. Today, the white suit was not just a wardrobe choice. It was a uniform of execution. I applied a sharp red lip, stepped into a pair of towering metallic stilettos, and headed for the venue. The Sterling family had spared absolutely no expense securing the sprawling historic grounds of the Commonwealth Country Club for the afternoon ceremony. As my black town car glided up the winding, oak-lined driveway, my phone vibrated with a secure message from my chief of intelligence. My private security team had been discreetly monitoring the perimeter and the social chatter of the event. The brief update confirmed exactly what I suspected my mother and sister were doing. Vivian and Chloe, facing imminent homelessness and absolute social ruin, had decided to play their final desperate card. They could not pay me off. They could not intimidate me in private. So they decided to completely destroy my credibility in public before I had the chance to speak. Since the moment I left the hotel room, Vivian had been frantically working the early arrivals. She had cornered Arthur Sterling, his wife, and their circle of high society billionaire friends, spinning a tragic, tearful narrative. With manufactured sobs, Vivian painted me as a deeply disturbed, mentally unstable woman, suffering from a severe, unhinged, psychotic break. She claimed that my sudden assertions of wealth and power were complete delusions of grandeur, triggered by a bitter, lifelong jealousy over Chloe's perfect, beautiful life. Chloe had seamlessly joined the performance, playing the fragile, traumatized bride. She had wept openly to Preston's aunts and cousins, claiming that I had violently attacked her in the hotel room, throwing hot coffee on my own dress in a fit of hysterical, manic rage just to frame her. They branded me a pathological liar, a fraudster, and a dangerous sociopath who was actively trying to extort them and sabotage the Sterling family name out of pure spite. Their strategy was incredibly transparent. They wanted to inoculate the entire guest list. They needed to ensure that if I walked into that reception and opened my mouth about the Vanguard foreclosure, the stolen trust fund, or the $25,000 dinner bill, every single wealthy guest in attendance would instantly dismiss it as the ravings of a jealous, crazy sister. They were trying to build a fortress of lies to hide inside. My town car rolled to a smooth halt in front of the grand marble entrance of the clubhouse. The crisp afternoon air carried the scent of imported orchids and ocean breeze. I stepped out of the vehicle, smoothing the crisp lapels of my white blazer. As I walked up the stone pathway toward the manicured lawns, where the pre-ceremony cocktail hour was already underway, the reaction was instantaneous. Heads began to turn the moment my white stilettos hit the pavement. The whispers started like a brush fire spreading through dry grass. The sight of the bride's sister, stripped of the mandated pink bridal party attire and wearing a striking, immaculate white power suit, sent a visible shockwave through the gathered crowd. Wealthy women in flowing pastel designer gowns raised their champagne flutes to their lips to hide their gaping mouths. Men in tailored tuxedos adjusted their ties, their eyes darting nervously between me and the main doors. I could feel the weight of 100 judgmental whispered conversations pressing down on me. I knew exactly what they were saying. I knew the poison my mother had poured into their ears. But I did not lower my gaze. I did not rush my pace. I walked with the measured, predatory grace of a woman who held absolute power. I reached the sweeping, curved marble steps leading up to the private enclosed garden where the ceremony seating was arranged. Standing at the top of the stairs, directly flanking the ornate wrought iron gates, were 3 heavily built private security contractors. They were not the country club's standard valets or ushers. They wore dark-fitted suits, coiled earpieces, and the stern, unblinking expressions of men hired specifically to handle high-profile physical threats. Arthur Sterling had clearly taken Vivian's frantic warnings about my supposed mental instability very seriously. As I placed my foot firmly on the first marble step, two of the massive guards immediately broke their rigid stance. They stepped forward in unison, moving with practiced synchronization to form a solid, immovable human wall directly across my path. The ambient chatter from the nearby guests abruptly died down. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. A thick, suffocating silence fell over the courtyard as the high society crowd turned their full attention to the confrontation unfolding at the gates. "Excuse me, ma'am," the lead guard stated. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that carried a distinct, undeniable warning. He held up a massive, calloused hand, his palm facing outward in a universal gesture to halt. "I am going to have to ask you to step back down the stairs." I stopped on the second step, standing perfectly upright, my posture radiating cold authority. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. "I am the bride's sister," I stated calmly, my words projecting clearly in the sudden dead quiet of the outdoor reception area. The guard did not waver. He did not offer an apologetic smile. Instead, he reached into the inner breast pocket of his dark suit jacket and pulled out a laminated photograph. He held it up so I could see it clearly. I recognized the image instantly. It was a picture of me likely downloaded and printed directly from my mother's social media page just an hour ago. A thick, jagged red X had been drawn aggressively across my face in permanent marker. "We are aware of exactly who you are," Ms. Williams, the lead guard, replied, his tone entirely devoid of any polite customer service pretense. He stepped half a pace closer, using his imposing physical size to try and force me backward down the steps. "The bride and her mother have explicitly requested that you be barred from the premises. You are flagged as a severe security risk. You need to turn around and leave the property immediately, or we will be forced to physically remove you in front of all these people." But before I could speak, a commanding, thunderous voice echoed across the courtyard. "Stand down immediately." The crowd parted instantly as Admiral Harrison strode toward the gates. The patriarch of the Sterling family, a decorated military legend who carried an aura of absolute authority, looked furious. His sharp eyes locked onto the lead guard, who immediately paled and took a step back. "Sir, we have strict orders from the bride," the guard stammered, holding up his hands defensively. "I do not care what the bride ordered," Admiral Harrison barked, his voice echoing off the marble pillars. "You are currently attempting to assault a decorated naval intelligence officer. Do you have any idea who this woman is?" The guards froze, exchanging panicked glances. Admiral Harrison turned his attention to me, the anger in his expression instantly melting into profound respect. He did not see the jealous, unstable sister Vivian had desperately tried to portray. He saw Commander Nia Williams, the cyber warfare specialist, whose critical intelligence interception had single-handedly saved his son's unit from a lethal ambush overseas 5 years ago. He saw the woman who had brought his bloodline home alive. Admiral Harrison stepped past the paralyzed security team and extended his arm toward me. "Commander," he said, his tone ringing with deep, unquestioning reverence, "it is an absolute honor to have you here. Please allow me." I offered him a respectful nod, ignoring the stunned gasps of the surrounding guests, and linked my arm through his. The walk down the aisle was a masterpiece of extreme contrast. The hushed high society crowd watched in absolute shock as the very woman the bride had just branded a psychotic pariah was personally escorted by the most respected billionaire in the room. My own flesh and blood had treated me like a criminal and a stain on their reputation, yet here was a military legend treating me like royalty. He bypassed the standard guest seating, entirely guiding me straight to the front row and gesturing to the prime VIP seat directly next to his own. At the front of the altar, beneath an extravagant arch of imported white orchids, stood Chloe. She was mid-conversation with Preston, wearing her custom designer gown, reveling in her moment of absolute triumph. Then she looked up, her eyes locked onto the front row. She saw me sitting in the seat of honor, untouched, unapologetic, and glaringly visible in my immaculate white power suit. She saw Admiral Harrison leaning over to speak to me with a warm, familiar smile. The blood drained completely from Chloe's face. Her entire reality, the fortress of lies she had spent the morning desperately building to destroy my reputation, collapsed in a single instant. The Sterlings were not looking at me with disgust. They were looking at me with absolute awe. Chloe's hands began to shake. The fragile, victimized bride persona she had perfected vanished, replaced by a blinding, reckless fury. She could not stand the sight of me occupying the space she believed belonged only to her. She completely lost her mind. Ignoring Preston's confused whisper, Chloe turned sharply toward the priest. She ripped the microphone directly out of the startled clergyman's hands. The microphone let out a loud, piercing screech of feedback that echoed across the manicured lawns, silencing the 500 elite guests instantly. Chloe gripped the microphone tightly, her face twisted into a mask of pure venom, staring directly at me as she prepared to incinerate whatever was left of our family in front of the entire world. The piercing screech of microphone feedback faded into the manicured trees, leaving a stunned, breathless silence in its wake. 500 of the East Coast's most elite, influential figures sat frozen in their gilded chairs, their eyes darting between the altar and the front row. Chloe stood beneath the towering arch of imported white orchids, her knuckles white as she gripped the microphone. For a fraction of a second, her face remained a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. Then, with the practiced precision of a seasoned sociopath, she shifted. The raw rage melted away, replaced by a trembling, fragile lower lip and wide, terrified eyes. She took a ragged, shuddering breath, perfectly manufacturing the image of a heartbroken bride pushed to the absolute brink of despair. I did not flinch. I did not stand up to defend myself or shout objections. I simply leaned back into the velvet cushioning of my front row VIP chair. I crossed my arms smoothly over the immaculate white silk of my blazer, anchoring myself in the absolute calm before the storm. I let my expression settle into a look of mild, detached amusement, watching my sister construct her own digital and social guillotine. I am so incredibly sorry to interrupt my own wedding, Chloe began, her voice cracking perfectly as it echoed through the high-end sound system. Her fake tears spilled over her eyelashes, ruining her pristine bridal makeup in a way that looked tragically beautiful. This was supposed to be a day of pure joy, the joining of two families. But I cannot, in good conscience, stand before God, before my wonderful groom, and before the Sterling family, while a severe and dangerous threat is sitting right there in our front row. She raised a trembling finger, pointing it directly at me. A collective gasp rippled through the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Hundreds of eyes pivoted to fixate on the white power suit I wore, the ultimate symbol of disrespect at a traditional wedding. "My sister Nia is profoundly unwell," Chloe cried into the microphone, her voice dropping to a theatrical, mournful whisper. "She has suffered from severe, violent delusions for years. She is a deeply disturbed, psychopathic woman who has made it her life's mission to destroy my happiness out of pure, unrelenting jealousy." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a wave of high society judgment and morbid fascination. Beside me, Admiral Harrison stiffened, his jaw tightening so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. He knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. He knew the absolute absurdity of the words leaving Chloe's mouth. But he remained seated, his sharp military instincts recognizing that I was in complete control of the battlefield. I offered him a microscopic, reassuring nod, keeping my eyes locked on the altar. "She did not come here today to celebrate my marriage," Chloe sobbed, burying her face momentarily in her free hand. "She came here to extort my family. She showed up at my hotel room this morning in a manic episode, claiming she owned billions of dollars in real estate, claiming she secretly owned the Sterling family's favorite restaurants. She demanded millions of dollars from us, threatening to sabotage this wedding and drag the pristine Sterling name through the mud if we did not pay her off. She is a dangerous, delusional fraud." Right on cue, Vivian broke away from her seat in the second row and rushed up the marble steps of the altar. She wrapped her arms protectively around Chloe's trembling shoulders, turning her own tear-streaked face toward the audience. "It is true," Vivian wailed, playing the tragic, long-suffering matriarch to absolute perfection. We have tried everything. We have spent our entire life savings trying to get her psychiatric help. We mortgaged our family home just to pay for her treatments, but she is completely unhinged. She hates the Preston family. She is wildly jealous of the love and acceptance the Sterlings have shown my Chloe. Please, you have to believe us. She is trying to blackmail all of you. The audacity of the lie was almost beautiful in its structural perfection. Vivian was using the very real impending foreclosure of our family home, the foreclosure I had initiated just hours ago, and spinning it as a tragic medical expense for her supposedly insane daughter. She was creating an impenetrable emotional shield, ensuring that any financial ruin that hit her tomorrow would be viewed by this elite crowd as the tragic result of my mental illness rather than her own criminal fraud. The garden was filled with the sounds of hushed outrage. I could hear the whispers of the wives in the rows behind me expressing deep pity for the poor traumatized bride. I could feel the disdain radiating from the corporate executives who were analyzing my calm demeanor as evidence of cold, calculated sociopathy. Preston Sterling stood frozen next to his bride, looking deeply uncomfortable and entirely out of his depth. He placed a tentative hand on Chloe's back, trying to comfort her, totally oblivious to the fact that he was marrying a financial parasite who had just signed his family's death warrant. Arthur Sterling, the billionaire CEO and patriarch of the younger Sterling generation, stood up from his seat on the groom's side of the aisle. His face was thunderous, his protective instincts triggered by the tears of his soon-to-be daughter-in-law. He glared at me with absolute contempt, clearly preparing to signal his own security detail to have me violently dragged from the property. Arthur Preston. Please, Chloe begged into the microphone, her voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch. Please protect our family. Have her removed. Have her arrested. She is going to try to destroy your empire. She will not stop until she ruins everything you have built. Get her out of here. I uncrossed my arms and slowly rested my hands on my knees. I did not break eye contact with Chloe. I did not offer a single word of defense. I simply waited. I knew the exact timing of the automated protocols I had initiated from my suite that morning. I knew that the Vanguard server clusters had finished compiling the final execution orders. The digital guillotine was already dropping. Just as Arthur Sterling raised his hand to summon the guards, a sound sliced through the heavy, judgmental air of the garden. It was a sharp, aggressive synthetic siren. It did not sound like a standard ringtone or a generic text message alert. It was the distinct ear-piercing blare of a Level 1 executive override, a military-grade security alarm designed to bypass all silent modes and do not disturb settings. The sound erupted from the breast pocket of Preston Sterling's custom tuxedo. A split second later, the exact same blaring high-decibel siren exploded from Arthur Sterling's jacket. The synchronized alarms echoed across the manicured lawns, completely drowning out Chloe's theatrical sobs. The crowd flinched, the murmurs of pity instantly silenced by the jarring, unnatural noise. Arthur and Preston both froze, their hands dropping to their pockets in sheer confusion. These were men who controlled vast swaths of the global financial market. They knew exactly what that specific alarm tone meant. It was an alert reserved exclusively for catastrophic apocalyptic breaches within the Sterling corporate mainframe. It meant that their firewalls had been decimated, their secure servers had been breached, and their primary financial arteries were currently bleeding out. Arthur's hands were shaking as he ripped his encrypted smartphone from his pocket. Preston mirrored the movement, pulling out his own device with wide, panicked eyes. I watched as they both looked down at their glowing screens. The screens were flashing violently, strobing with an aggressive solid red light. Black text crawled across the crimson background in real time, detailing the absolute devastation of their corporate infrastructure. The color drained from Arthur Sterling's face so fast, he looked as though he had been physically struck. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire who had been ready to throw me out on the street just seconds ago was suddenly reduced to a terrified, breathless old man. His mouth fell open, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror as he stared at the digital readout. Preston stumbled backward on the altar, physically swaying as his knees buckled. He dropped his phone onto the marble floor of the altar, the device clattering loudly against the stone, its screen still strobing that lethal bleeding red. Every drop of blood vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse in a tuxedo. Chloe's fake tears dried instantly. She lowered the microphone, staring at her groom in total bewilderment. "Preston," she whispered, the panic in her voice no longer manufactured. "Preston, what is it? What is happening?" Arthur Sterling slowly lifted his head, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. He did not look at his son. He did not look at his crying, fraudulent bride. Arthur looked directly at me. I met Arthur Sterling's horrified gaze with absolute unyielding calm. I did not offer a smug smile. I did not gloat. I simply sat back in my velvet chair, crossed my arms over the pristine white silk of my blazer, and let the crushing weight of his realization settle over him. He knew. In that single agonizing fraction of a second, the billionaire patriarch connected the dots. He realized that the woman he had just ordered his security to throw out was the architect of the digital apocalypse currently devouring his empire. But my sister, utterly consumed by her own theatrical performance, was completely oblivious to the tectonic shift that had just occurred on the altar. Chloe had noticed the alarms, of course, but her narcissism blinded her to their meaning. She assumed it was just another minor inconvenience, another momentary distraction from her grand moment in the spotlight. Gripping the microphone with white-knuckled desperation, she brought it back to her lips, determined to finish her masterpiece of character assassination. "Look at her!" Chloe sobbed, pointing a shaking finger down at me as genuine fat tears rolled down her cheeks. "She is sitting there, completely unfazed, plotting how to extort us. She is a sick, jealous, sociopathic woman who could not stand to see me marry into a family as wonderful and loving as the Sterlings. Today, my sister came here to blackmail us, to demand millions of dollars, and to sabotage my happiness out of pure spite." Vivian, sensing that the crowd was still processing the jarring interruption of the security alarms, rushed up the marble steps to flank her golden child. She threw her arms around Chloe's shoulders, pulling the fragile bride into a protective embrace. Vivian turned her face toward the 500 elite guests, her expression twisted in a mask of profound maternal agony. "It is the truth," Vivian cried out, her voice cracking with manufactured heartbreak. "We have lived in fear of her for years. We have sacrificed everything to protect this wedding from her manic episodes. Please do not listen to a word she says. She is a pathological liar trying to destroy the Sterling family name." The high society crowd shifted uncomfortably in their gilded chairs. A low, continuous hum of frantic whispering washed over the manicured garden. Wealthy socialites and powerful executives leaned into one another, their eyes darting between the weeping mother-daughter duo on the altar, and me sitting perfectly composed in the front row alongside a decorated military legend. I did not defend myself. I did not need to. I simply watched the inevitable implosion unfold. Arthur Sterling was no longer looking at me. The sheer terror that had drained the blood from his face was rapidly transforming into something far more volatile. His complexion shifted from a sickly ashen gray to a deep mottled crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his stiff white collar. He slipped his strobing, useless smartphone back into his tuxedo pocket, his movements rigid and mechanical. He turned slowly toward the center of the altar. He did not look at his son, who was still staring blankly at the floor in a state of catatonic shock. Arthur's eyes locked onto Chloe and Vivian. The raw, unfiltered hatred radiating from the billionaire was so intense it seemed to lower the ambient temperature of the entire garden. Chloe, misreading his fury entirely, offered her future father-in-law a fragile, trembling smile. She thought he was angry on her behalf. She thought her crocodile tears had successfully manipulated the patriarch into unleashing his wrath upon me. "Arthur, please," Chloe whispered into the microphone, her voice a delicate, pleading flutter. "Please do not let her ruin our day. Make them take her away." Arthur Sterling did not speak. He marched across the marble floor of the altar with heavy, thundering footsteps. He closed the distance between them in seconds, moving with a predatory aggression that made Vivian flinch and take an involuntary step backward. Chloe kept the fragile smile plastered on her face, expecting him to offer a comforting embrace or a few words of reassurance. Instead, Arthur reached out and grabbed the microphone directly from her hand. He did not ask for it. He did not gently pry it from her fingers. He violently snatched the heavy metal device from her grasp with such sudden brutal force that Chloe stumbled forward, nearly twisting her ankle in her towering bridal heels. A sharp, ear-piercing shriek of feedback ripped through the sound system, causing several guests in the front rows to wince and cover their ears. Arthur stabilized the microphone, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. He turned his back on Chloe completely and faced the sea of 500 elite guests. The courtyard was instantly plunged into a dead, suffocating silence. You could hear the faint rustling of the wind through the imported orchids. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur's voice boomed over the speakers. It was not the warm, welcoming tone of a father celebrating his son's union. It was a cold, jagged roar of absolute fury. "I apologize for the disruption and for the jarring nature of this announcement, but there will be no vows exchanged on this property today." A collective, synchronized gasp rose from the crowd. Women clutched their pearls. Men sat up straight in their chairs, their eyes widening in shock. The Sterling family did not come here this afternoon to celebrate a marriage. Arthur continued, his voice vibrating with lethal authority. "We came here to cancel it." The fallout was instantaneous. The pristine, untouchable facade that Chloe had spent years meticulously constructing shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The color drained from her face so completely she looked like a porcelain doll that had been drained of life. Her jaw dropped open, her eyes darting frantically around the crowd as the reality of Arthur's words slammed into her. "No!" Chloe gasped, her voice barely a squeak without the amplification of the microphone. "No, Arthur. Wait. You are confused. She lied to you. My sister lied to you." Desperate, cornered, and watching her billionaire lifestyle evaporate before her eyes, Chloe spun around to face her groom. Preston was still standing a few feet away, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. "Preston," Chloe cried, lunging forward and wrapping her hands frantically around his tuxedo jacket. "Baby, look at me. Look at me. Your father is confused. Nia is trying to ruin us. You have to tell him to stop. You have to do something." Preston looked down at the woman he was supposed to marry. For a fleeting second, Chloe's eyes begged him for salvation, banking on the years of manipulation and control she had exerted over him. But Preston did not look back with love or confusion or even pity. He looked at her as if she were a venomous snake that had just bitten him. "Get your hands off of me!" Preston growled, his voice thick with absolute disgust. With a violent, merciless jerk, he shoved her away. The physical rejection was so forceful that Chloe stumbled backward, her custom designer gown tangling around her legs. She collided heavily with Vivian, who let out a sharp, horrified shriek as she caught her daughter to keep them both from tumbling down the marble steps of the altar. Vivian stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to comprehend the total collapse of their golden ticket. The rich, powerful family they had sacrificed everything to merge with was now treating them like toxic waste in front of the entire Eastern Seaboard's elite. Arthur Sterling did not spare a single glance backward at the two women cowering on the altar. He raised the microphone back to his lips, ensuring that his next words would echo off every corner of the country club, cementing their ruin permanently into the annals of high society history. "The Sterling Corporation operates on a foundation of absolute integrity," Arthur announced, enunciating every syllable with crushing finality. "We do not tolerate extortion, we do not tolerate fraud, and we certainly do not welcome criminals into our family." The murmurs in the crowd grew into a frantic, buzzing frenzy, but Arthur's booming voice easily overpowered them. Especially Arthur continued, his eyes finally drifting down to meet mine in the front row, a silent, desperate plea for mercy hidden within his fury. "Especially a criminal who has just been flagged by our internal security networks, and who has just been issued an active federal arrest warrant by the National Security Agency for the catastrophic theft of classified military data." The words hung in the warm afternoon air, freezing the blood in the veins of every guest present. Chloe let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She gripped the edges of the floral arch, her knuckles bone-white, as if the physical structure could somehow protect her from the absolute annihilation raining down upon her. "Arthur, no!" She stammered, her voice thin and reedy. No, you are confused. I do not even know what you are talking about. I am just a bride. I do not know anything about military data. Arthur Sterling did not soften. His eyes were flat dead and entirely merciless. He turned his gaze to the crowd, effectively putting Chloe on trial before a jury of her high society peers. My son is the lead engineer for Sterling Aeronautics, Arthur bellowed, his voice echoing off the clubhouse walls. His secure home terminal holds proprietary classified schematics for next-generation drone propulsion systems contracts directly subsidized by the Department of Defense. For weeks, we have been tracking a catastrophic security breach. Someone had bypassed Preston's biometric locks, downloaded our core technological assets, and initiated a dark web auction to sell those schematics to a rival foreign contractor. Preston looked at Chloe, his face contorting with a sickening realization. You, he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and horror. You asked to use my laptop for wedding planning. You said you needed to finalize the seating charts while I was in the shower. Preston, baby, no, I was looking at seating charts, Chloe shrieked, reaching out for him, but he recoiled violently, slapping her hand away. Do not touch him, Arthur roared, stepping between his son and the deceitful woman who had nearly ruined him. You did not just look at seating charts, Chloe. You downloaded 40 gigabytes of encrypted files. You thought you were so incredibly clever using a VPN and a masked IP address. And why? Because our forensic accountants just finished ripping through your personal finances. We know exactly why you needed a massive, untraceable offshore payday. Vivian let out a whimpering moan, shrinking back against the floral arrangements as the spotlight of truth swung toward her. You are drowning in $500,000 of predatory high-interest debt, Arthur stated, his voice laced with absolute disgust. You and your mother took out fraudulent loans to fund your designer wardrobes, your luxury vacations, and this sickeningly lavish wedding. You leveraged property you did not even own. You were completely broke, facing imminent foreclosure, and instead of living within your means, you decided to commit high treason. You decided to sell my company's secrets to bail yourself out. The collective gasp from the 500 guests was deafening. The high society women who had been pitying Chloe just moments before were now looking at her as if she were carrying the plague. The executives in the audience muttered darkly to one another, instantly calculating the massive fallout of corporate espionage. Chloe was hyperventilating, her chest heaving against her custom corset. It is a setup, she screamed, her voice cracking as she pointed a manic, shaking finger at me. She did this. Nia did this. She is a hacker, she knows computers. She planted those files to frame me, because she is a jealous, psychotic freak. Arthur, you have to listen to me. She is the one who set me up. Arthur stopped pacing. The furious, explosive energy radiating from him suddenly settled into an eerie, terrifying calm. He turned his back on Chloe entirely. He walked to the edge of the marble altar, looked down at the front row, and locked eyes with me. The entire crowd followed his gaze. 500 pairs of eyes shifted from the hysterical bride to the woman sitting perfectly composed in the pristine white power suit. The sheer audacity of your lies is staggering, Arthur said quietly into the microphone, though his voice carried perfectly across the dead silent garden. You stand up here and brand this woman a delusional sociopath. You tried to convince us she is a jealous, unstable fraud who broke into your hotel room to extort you. Arthur took a slow, deliberate breath. Then, to the absolute astonishment of every billionaire socialite and Sterling family member in attendance, Arthur Sterling, the fiercely proud patriarch of a global empire, bowed his head to me in a gesture of profound, unwavering respect. 2 weeks ago, Sterling Aeronautics was subjected to a surprise blind audit by the Pentagon. Arthur announced, his voice ringing with absolute clarity. The Department of Defense detected an anomaly in our encrypted servers. They immediately dispatched their top cybersecurity asset to infiltrate our network, set a digital tripwire, and trace the traitor's IP address right to the source. He extended his hand toward me. The operative they sent was not a fraud. She is not a delusional extortionist, Arthur continued. She is the senior cybersecurity commander for the Department of Defense. She is the architect of the very trap you walked blindly into, Chloe. Commander Nia Williams is the sole reason my son is not currently being hauled away in handcuffs for your treason. A profound, heavy silence blanketed the courtyard. You could hear a pin drop. Vivian's legs gave out completely. She collapsed onto the marble floor of the altar, her expensive dress pooling around her as she began to hyperventilate. The fortress of lies had not just crumbled, it had been pulverized into dust. She had spent the entire morning telling the most powerful people in the state that I was a deranged, jealous lunatic. Now those same people were realizing that I was a high-ranking federal commander who held their entire lives in the palm of my hand. Chloe stumbled backward, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly. She looked from me to Arthur, then to Preston, searching for a single sympathetic face. She found none. The Sterling family looked at her with pure, unadulterated venom. Her friends in the bridal party had physically backed away, distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout. You? Chloe choked out, her voice a hollow, broken rasp as she stared at me. The realization finally pierced through her blinding narcissism. I had not just bought her debt. I had not just foreclosed on her house. I had meticulously orchestrated her absolute destruction on a federal level, letting her greed and arrogance guide her straight into a steel trap. You planned this, you let me do it. I did not say a word. I simply uncrossed my legs, smoothed a microscopic crease from my white silk trousers, and offered her a slow, terrifyingly serene smile. I did not let you do anything, Chloe. I said, my voice carrying effortlessly without the need for a microphone. I simply stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own actions. You wanted a stage. Now you have one. I will sue you! Chloe shrieked, a desperate animalistic cry tearing from her throat. She lunged toward the edge of the stairs, her face contorted in madness. I will take everything you have. I will destroy you. You are a monster. You are in no position to sue anyone. Arthur Sterling interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, signaling the absolute end of the confrontation. Your assets are frozen, your family is destitute, and your wedding is officially over. As if Arthur's words had summoned them, the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the manicured garden burst open with a loud, resounding crash. The heads of 500 guests whipped around in unison. Striding down the central aisle of the wedding venue, their footsteps echoing sharply against the stone pathway, were three individuals dressed in sharp, unassuming plainclothes. They moved with a rigid, undeniable authority, completely ignoring the sea of shocked faces parting to let them through. At the front of the trio was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a severe expression. As he reached the midpoint of the aisle, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a leather wallet. With a swift, practiced motion, he flipped it open, holding it high for everyone on the altar to see. The silver shield caught the afternoon sun, gleaming brightly. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The lead agent announced, his voice cutting through the garden like a blade. The three agents did not wait for an invitation or an explanation. They bypassed the paralyzing shock of the country club crowd, marching in perfect synchronized lockstep directly toward the altar. The heavy thud of their tactical shoes against the marble steps snapped the remaining tension in the garden like a dry twig. I stepped back from the epicenter of the confrontation, smoothly descending the first few steps to distance myself from the immediate blast radius. I moved toward a velvet-cushioned wrought iron bench positioned perfectly in the front row, meant originally for the most honored guests. Setting my crystal glass of champagne down on the small silver cocktail table beside it, I sat down, crossed my legs, and folded my arms over my chest. I allowed a slow, deeply satisfied smirk to curve the edge of my mouth. I had built the stage set, the lighting, and written the script. Now I was just a spectator, enjoying the grand finale, perfectly suspended in the calm center of the hurricane I had created. Chloe Vance, the lead agent, barked, his voice projecting with practiced, inescapable authority. He did not ask a question. It was a definitive, lethal strike. You are under arrest for corporate espionage, grand larceny, wire fraud, and severe violations of the Espionage Act. Chloe froze, her jaw unhinging. For a second, her brain simply could not process the words. You are making a mistake, she stammered, her hands flying up to her chest as if she could physically ward off the federal government. I am the bride. I am marrying Preston Sterling. You cannot do this to me today. The agents were entirely unmoved by her matrimonial status or her designer gown. Two of them stepped forward, flanked her on either side, and reached for her arms. Chloe snapped. The last remaining fragments of her carefully constructed demure golden child persona disintegrated entirely, revealing the ugly entitled core underneath. As the agent's large hand clamped down on her bare forearm, she let out a visceral, blood-curdling shriek. She jerked her arm back with surprising violence, kicking out wildly with her heavy crystal-encrusted heel. "Get your filthy hands off of me!" she screamed, her voice tearing at the seams, echoing harshly over the manicured lawns. "Do you know who I am? Do you know how much this custom dress costs? Do not touch me." The agents did not care about the French lace or the hand-sewn pearls. With ruthless, practiced efficiency, they overpowered her flailing limbs and twisted her arms behind her back. The delicate, sheer fabric of her $100,000 gown ripped with a loud, sickening tear, the bodice fracturing under the force of the struggle. The sharp sound of cold steel ratcheting shut echoed through the dead silence of the garden as the handcuffs clicked securely over her wrists, binding her hands together over the oversized silk bow at the base of her spine. Chloe thrashed wildly, her perfect, elegant updo unraveling instantly, sending long, tangled blonde hair sticking to her tear-streaked, flushed face. She looked like a feral animal trapped in a snare of white tulle. She twisted her neck, her wild, manic eyes searching the altar for her savior. "Preston," she wailed, her voice cracking into a desperate, pathetic sob. "Preston, tell them to stop. Do something. You are a sterling. Call your lawyers and pay them off. You promised to protect me. You promised to love me." Preston did not move to help her. He took another deliberate step backward, completely and utterly repulsed. He looked at the woman he was supposed to spend the rest of his life with, his face a mask of profound disgust. "You stole from my family," he said, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "You used my computer to betray my father and my company. You are nothing but a parasite. I hope they lock you away for the rest of your miserable life." Preston's cold, unyielding rejection broke the final seal on Chloe's sanity. Realizing that the sterling fortune was permanently out of her reach, she began to thrash against the federal agents with renewed violence, spitting pure vitriol at the man she had just sworn to love. "You are a weak, pathetic coward, Preston!" she roared, her face contorting into an ugly, hateful sneer that made the gathered guests flinch. "You think you are so brilliant, but you left your highly secure laptop sitting on the kitchen island, unlocked like an absolute idiot. You are nothing without your father's money. I did this because I had to. I did it because my mother made me." Vivian, who was still cowering on the marble floor of the altar, let out a loud, horrified gasp. "Chloe, no!" she pleaded, raising a shaking manicured hand toward her daughter. "Shut up!" Chloe screamed at her own mother, her voice vibrating with manic fury. "You forced me into this! You took out those fraudulent loans! You made me buy this dress, book the luxury honeymoon, and keep up this pathetic illusion for your country club friends. You told me we were going to be homeless. You told me to get the money however I could. This is your fault. You ruined my life." The elite guests, sitting in the rows around me, began murmuring in absolute horror. Cell phones were discreetly pulled out from tuxedo pockets and designer clutches. Billionaires and socialites who had spent the last hour whispering about my supposed mental breakdown were now watching the pristine, perfect bride publicly confess to federal crimes while viciously throwing her own mother under the bus. The illusion of the flawless Vance family was obliterated, exposed as a hollow, rotting shell of greed and desperation. "You have the right to remain silent," the lead agent stated, his voice easily, cutting through her hysterical ranting as he began reading her Miranda rights. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Chloe continued to kick and scream, but she was no match for the two heavily built agents. They forced her forward, marching her unceremoniously down the marble steps. She stumbled in her stilettos, the heavy, ruined train of her dress dragging through the dirt and grass. She was hauled down the exact same aisle she had planned to walk down as a triumphant, conquering bride. Now she was executing a humiliating perp walk in front of 500 of the most powerful people on the eastern seaboard, her hands bound behind her back in cold steel. As they dragged her past the front row, her manic eyes locked onto me. She stopped fighting the agents for a fraction of a second. She stared at my pristine white suit, my relaxed posture, and the calm, victorious smile resting on my face. She let out one final, agonizing scream of pure, undiluted hatred before the agents forced her out through the wrought iron gates, the heavy wooden doors of the clubhouse slamming shut behind them. The silence that fell over the garden was absolute. The only sound was the distant, fading wail of police sirens approaching the country club gates to transport their new high-profile prisoner. On the altar, Vivian was entirely alone. Her golden child was gone, hauled away to a federal holding cell. The wealthy, powerful son-in-law she had banked her entire future on was standing across the altar looking at her with total revulsion. The $500,000 debt she owed to Vanguard Private Credit was actively foreclosing on her house. She had no money, no social standing, no allies, and absolutely no way out. The elaborate, suffocating web of lies she had spent her entire life spinning had finally snapped, trapping her in the center with nowhere left to run. Vivian slowly pushed herself up from the marble floor. Her expensive mother-of-the-bride gown was wrinkled and stained. Her carefully applied makeup was ruined, leaving dark, wet streaks down her cheeks. She looked frantically around the garden, her eyes darting from Arthur Sterling's furious face to the disgusted expressions of the high society guests who were already beginning to stand up and gather their things, eager to flee the scene of the scandal. Then her eyes found me. I was the only person left in her world who held any actual power. I was the CEO who owned her insurmountable debt. I was the federal commander who had orchestrated the sting that caught her daughter. I was the child she had thrown away, starved of affection, and treated like an unwanted burden for my entire life, simply because I refused to be a prop in her shallow existence. Vivian let out a broken, wheezing sob. She scrambled down the marble steps, stumbling in her desperation. She did not walk. She practically crawled. She moved with a frantic, pathetic urgency, rushing across the short expanse of grass separating the altar from the front row. Before the country club security could even step forward to intercept her, Vivian threw herself forward. She collapsed onto the manicured grass, dropping heavily onto her knees, right at the tips of my white stilettos. Her hands, trembling and slick with cold sweat, clutched desperately at the pristine fabric of my trousers. She did not care about the damp earth staining her custom silk gown, nor did she care that the most powerful socialites and corporate titans on the eastern seaboard were watching her completely unravel. Pure, unadulterated survival instinct had finally overridden her vanity. "Nia, please!" Vivian wailed, her voice, a ragged, breathless screech that scraped against the heavy silence of the garden. "You have to stop them. You are her sister. You work for the government. You have the power to fix this." She tugged at my legs, her mascara running in thick, dark rivers down her pale cheeks. She was entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, impeccably groomed matriarch who had strutted into this venue hours ago. "Call them off, Nia," she begged, her pitch rising to an hysterical shriek. "Tell the agents it was a mistake. Tell them it was a cybersecurity drill. You have the security clearance, you can make this all go away. Blood is thicker than water. Family is the most important thing in the world. Family comes first. You cannot just stand there and watch your own sister go to federal prison. You cannot watch us lose everything, watch us die out here and not save us. I am your mother." The psychological manipulation was a desperate, transparent masterpiece. She was deploying the ultimate cultural trump card, weaponizing the very concept of family that she had spent my entire life destroying. The remaining guests in the garden, those who had not yet fled the catastrophic scene, held their collective breath. Among them were my aunts, uncles, and extended cousins who had spent the last decade treating me like an embarrassing afterthought. My Aunt Patricia, who had snickered at my career choices over every Thanksgiving dinner, was staring at me with wide, expectant eyes. Uncle Robert, who had endlessly praised Chloe's fabricated achievements while ignoring my existence, looked completely paralyzed. They all came from a world where scandals were swept under the expensive rugs, where wealth, influence, and connections were ruthlessly utilized to protect the family name at all costs. They fully expected the suffocating pressure of societal obligation to crush me. They believed that faced with a weeping mother and the sacred, undeniable invocation of family duty, I would inevitably soften. In their minds, no daughter could withstand a mother begging on her knees. They waited for me to reach into my blazer, pull out my federal credentials, and shield the golden child from the catastrophic consequences of her own felonies. I looked down at the pathetic weeping woman groveling at my feet. I thought about the years I spent locked in my small room studying, until my eyes bled while she threw lavish catered parties to celebrate Chloe's mediocre milestones. I thought about the massive fraudulent loans she had taken out against the family estate, fully intending to let the financial ruin fall onto my shoulders. I thought about her standing on that altar just 10 minutes ago, throwing her arms around Chloe and amplifying her vicious lies, actively trying to convince a billionaire patriarch to have me violently thrown out onto the street like trash. When she needed a scapegoat, I was an outsider. Now that she needed a savior, I was her precious flesh and blood. The blinding hypocrisy of it did not make me angry. It simply validated every boundary I had ever built against her. I did not flinch. I did not reach out to stroke her hair or offer a comforting hand. I did not break under the heavy, judgmental stares of the extended family waiting for me to play the role of the dutiful, forgiving daughter. Instead, I slowly uncrossed my arms. I smoothed the lapels of my white silk blazer, ensuring my movements were perfectly deliberate and entirely unbothered. Then, with a smooth, fluid motion, I bent my knees and slowly crouched down, bringing my face perfectly level with hers. Vivian's breath hitched. She stopped tugging at my trousers, her tear-streaked face freezing in anticipation. She searched my expression frantically, looking for a glimmer of hesitation, a spark of daughterly devotion, or a shred of empathy she could latch onto and exploit. My eyes met hers, and I let her look deep into the absolute void where my filial piety used to be. My gaze was flat, cold, and entirely dead. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, and my eyes held not a single microscopic trace of pity. I let the silence stretch, stretching it until it became a physical weight, pressing down on the manicured garden. 500 of the most powerful people in the state were leaning forward in their gilded chairs, hanging on my every breath. They were waiting for the traditional expected response. They were waiting for the dutiful daughter to break, to reach down and comfort her weeping mother, to use her high-level federal clearance to shield her family from the devastating consequences of their own actions. Instead, I stood up. I rose to my full height, towering over the woman sobbing in the grass. I looked down at Vivian, watching her frantically search my face for a lifeline that did not exist. I pitched my voice perfectly. I did not shout, but I spoke with a sharp, resonant clarity that carried effortlessly to the very back row of the stunned audience. Family, I repeated, rolling the word around in my mouth as if it were coated in poison. You want to talk about family, Vivian? She flinched at the sound of her first name, her tear-streaked face looking up at me in absolute terror. She opened her mouth to shush me, her eyes darting frantically toward the billionaire Sterling, still desperately trying to keep her dark, ugly truths hidden from high society. But her control over me had evaporated years ago, and I was going to make sure everyone in this garden knew it. When you emptied out the college fund I spent 4 years working 3 part-time jobs to build, I asked, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a scalpel. When you drained my entire savings just so you could buy Chloe a luxury sports car for her sweet 16 to impress your friends, did you remember blood ties then? A collective horrified gasp rippled through the crowd. I saw Aunt Patricia, who had spent the last decade praising Vivian's financial acumen, turn an ashen, sickly shade of gray. Uncle Robert stared at the grass, looking physically ill. Vivian shook her head frantically, her hands hovering in the air, as if trying to physically wave my words away. Nia, please. She rasped, her voice a desperate, pathetic wheeze. Not here. Not in front of everyone. When I was deployed overseas, I continued mercilessly cutting over her pleas. When I was lying in a military triage unit after a cyber warfare breach nearly took my life, and you called me on a secured line just to tell me I was a disgrace. Do you remember what you said to me? You told me I was a foolish embarrassment for joining the service instead of finding a wealthy man to marry. You told me I was useless because I could not pay your country club dues. Did you remember the sanctity of family then, Vivian? The garden was so quiet I could hear the faint rustle of the expensive silk dresses in the rows behind me. The socialites and executives who had spent the entire morning judging my white suit and my supposed mental instability were now staring at Vivian with unadulterated revulsion. The facade of the wealthy, loving, perfect Vance family had been stripped away, exposing the parasitic, abusive reality underneath. You do not get to invoke the concept of family, only when your fraudulent empire is burning to the ground. I stated, my tone dropping to a lethal, icy calm. Blood does not give you the right to use me as your personal disposable ATM. It does not give you a free pass to treat me like absolute trash for 25 years, and then drop to your knees begging for salvation when the federal government finally comes to collect. I looked past her trembling, kneeling form. Near the back of the garden, the 3 plainclothes FBI agents were struggling to subdue my sister. Chloe was fighting them like a feral animal, her screaming curses ripping through the pristine atmosphere of the country club. She was thrashing against the cold steel of the handcuffs, her ruined bridal gown dragging through the dirt, demanding that Preston call his lawyers and save her. I locked eyes with the lead agent. I did not blink. "Do your job, agents," I commanded, my voice projecting with absolute authority. The lead agent stopped grappling with Chloe for a fraction of a second. He looked across the garden at me, recognizing the rank and the clearance I held. He offered a sharp, deferential nod. Without another word of warning to the hysterical bride, the agents hauled Chloe up by her arms and forcefully marched her out through the heavy wooden doors of the venue. Her frantic, echoing screams were abruptly cut off as the doors slammed shut behind her, sealing her fate. I turned my attention back to the woman groveling at my feet. Vivian was completely broken. Her chest heaved with violent, jagged sobs. She had lost her golden child, she had lost the sterling fortune, and she was entirely exposed in front of the very people whose approval she valued more than her own soul. But I was not finished. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers brushed against the thick, crisp manila envelope I had placed there this morning. I pulled it out, holding it up so the stark black logo of Vanguard Private Credit was visible to anyone paying attention. I did not hand it to her, I simply let it go. The heavy stack of legal documents hit the manicured grass right in front of Vivian's knees with a dull, heavy thud. She stared down at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. "You wanted to know who bought your $500,000 debt," I said coldly. "You are looking at her. Those are the finalized deeds of transfer and the active foreclosure notices. I own the mortgage to the estate." Vivian let out a sound that barely resembled a human voice. It was a high, thin keen of absolute despair. She reached out with a trembling, manicured hand, her fingers brushing against the edge of the envelope before recoiling in horror. "You have exactly 48 hours to pack whatever cheap knockoffs you can fit into a single suitcase and vacate my house," I announced, ensuring every single guest heard the timeline of her ruin. "If you or your belongings are still on my property by Monday morning, I will have the local police physically remove you for trespassing." Vivian gasped, clutching at her chest. "I am your mother. Where will I go? I have nothing." I looked down at her, feeling a profound, absolute sense of closure. The heavy, suffocating chain of obligation that had bound me to this toxic woman for my entire life finally snapped, dissolving into nothingness. From this exact moment onward, I said, my voice ringing with a terrifying permanent finality, "I have no mother, and I have no sister." The reality of those words slammed into Vivian with the force of a physical blow. The absolute certainty in my eyes told her that this was not a negotiation, not a threat she could manipulate her way out of later. It was the end. The realization of her total, inescapable ruin overwhelmed her fragile nervous system. Her eyes rolled back into her head, fluttering wildly for a second before slipping shut. With a soft, pathetic groan, she crumpled sideways. She collapsed onto the pristine lawn, fainting dead away, her expensive designer hat tumbling off her head and rolling into the dirt. I did not gasp. I did not bend down to check her pulse. I did not call for a medic. I simply stepped neatly over her unconscious body. I smoothed the lapels of my white silk blazer one last time, ensuring not a single crease marred the immaculate fabric. I kept my chin high, my shoulders thrown back, and I began the long walk down the central aisle of the garden. The crowd parted for me in absolute stunned silence. The elite guests, the corporate titans, the socialites who had whispered behind their hands about my audacity now pulled their chairs back to ensure I had a wide, unobstructed path. They looked at me with a mixture of profound shock and deep, fearful respect. As I passed the altar, I glanced briefly at the Sterling family. Preston was sitting on the steps, his head buried in his hands, looking completely devastated, but undeniably relieved that he had dodged a catastrophic bullet. Arthur Sterling, the billionaire patriarch who had been ready to throw me to the wolves just minutes ago, stood tall beside his son. As I walked past the powerful CEO, caught my eye, and offered a slow, solemn nod of gratitude. I did not nod back. I did not owe them anything. I kept walking, my heels clicking sharply against the stone pathway. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the country club and walked out into the bright, clear afternoon sun. I left the ruined garden, the shattered illusion of the golden child, and the completely collapsed Vance dynasty far behind me, stepping freely into a life that finally belonged entirely to me. That afternoon feels like a lifetime ago now. I'm standing by the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of my Manhattan penthouse, watching the city lights flicker into life as the sun dips below the skyline. The glass is cool against my fingertips, but the air inside is warm, infused with the quiet, unshakable peace that comes from absolute freedom. The heavy mahogany door to the living room opens with a soft click. I do not need to turn around to know who it is. The steady, confident cadence of his footsteps across the hardwood floor is a rhythm I know by heart. Julian steps up behind me. He is a formidable presence, a brilliantly successful attorney whose sharp legal mind is matched only by his profound, unconditional loyalty. He is the man who knew my worth long before the rest of the world caught on the partner who stood shoulder to shoulder with me while I built my empire in the shadows. He drapes a soft, tailored cashmere coat over my shoulders, his hands lingering warmly on my arms. He leans down, pressing a gentle kiss to the side of my head. There is no performance here, no calculated social maneuvering. With Julian, there is only genuine respect, and a love so grounding it makes the toxic chaos of my past feel like a distant, irrelevant fiction. We stand together in comfortable silence, looking out over the city, but my mind briefly traces the paths of the people I left behind in that manicured garden. The universe has a remarkably efficient way of balancing the scales when you stop trying to force its hand. Chloe traded her custom French lace and diamond tiaras for a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit. She is currently serving a mandatory 10-year sentence in a federal correctional facility in upstate New York. There are no cameras there, no social media followers to manipulate, and no wealthy suitors to charm. Her days are strictly regulated by bells and wardens, a harsh, monotonous reality for a woman who spent her entire life believing the rules did not apply to her. Her desperate attempts to appeal her sentence were swiftly denied, leaving her trapped in a concrete cell built by her own insatiable greed. Vivian's descent was even more spectacular. When Vanguard Private Credit officially seized the estate, she was forcibly evicted with nothing but 2 suitcases of clothes. Her elite country club friends, terrified of being associated with a federal espionage scandal, blocked her number overnight. The prestigious church community she had relentlessly bragged to publicly excommunicated her, stripping away the final shreds of her fabricated social standing. Today, the former matriarch of the Vance family lives in a cramped, rotting studio apartment in a notorious slum on the city's outskirts. To afford her meager rent, she took the only job she could get, without a background check or a reference. She works the night shift as a janitor at a decaying strip mall. The woman who once scoffed at anyone wearing off-the-rack clothing now spends her nights scrubbing public toilets and emptying trash cans, her hands permanently blistered from cheap industrial bleach. She is completely isolated, drowning in the suffocating poverty she once tried to force onto me. As for the Sterlings, their response was as swift and ruthless as expected. Within a week of the wedding day, Sting Arthur Sterling personally sent a formal, legally binding letter of apology directly to my federal office. The letter explicitly praised my handling of the cybersecurity breach and officially severed all ties with the Vance family. Preston completely vanished, changing his phone numbers and relocating to a European branch of his father's company. They excised Vivian and Chloe from their history as effortlessly as wiping mud from an expensive shoe. I turn away from the sprawling view of the city, pulling Julian's coat tighter around my shoulders. I lean back against his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. I look straight ahead, my voice calm, grounded, and ringing with absolute, undeniable truth. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is not destroying their lives with your own hands. It is letting them burn themselves to the ground with their own greed, while you watch from a peak they will never have the right to step onto. Julian smiles, his dark eyes reflecting the city lights and a deep shared understanding. He takes my hand, his fingers interlacing with mine. I smile back, a radiant, unfiltered expression of pure joy. The rotting shell of my past has been entirely incinerated, leaving nothing but fertile ground for the beautiful, extraordinary life I built for myself.